My name in my native language means wealth and prosperity. I suppose it is a very fitting irony, then, that I've never known such a reality for myself. I have, however, known one peculiar benefit, the benefit of being mistaken for someone wealthier by those who barely know me. It is a generous illusion because, in a modern capitalistic society, being poor and on top of that being recognized as poor is a form of damnation. In a world where money talks, a lack of wealth condemns you to silence. No one pays attention to the silence in a world built for those who can be loud. Ever since I was very young, it became evident to me through everyday observation that socio-economic status was life defining. It was subtle sometimes, like how, while I was expected to do well in school, my richer friends were rewarded for the bare minimum performance, and on other occasions blatantly visible, like when flaunting your parents' standing made you suddenly more impressive simply for being related to that person. It was weird. I mean, if I had less money, I couldn't get as many toys or as pretty of a dress as a richer kid would get, but that was pretty understandable even at that age. Toys were bought with money, dresses were bought with money. If you had less of it, you received less in return. That logic was easy to accept, but it wasn't so simple all the time. It was confusing when my friends would have weekly dentist appointments while I would only visit a doctor if I was severely ill, or when my friends would talk about where they would be traveling to for the annual summer vacations, while I mostly ended up at our grandparents' house for the time being. It didn't seem very fair that the quality of my childhood life altogether was associated with the amount in my father's wallet. The right to life, a basic constitutional right and a law of basic human rights, doesn't seem that helpful when anything beyond basic survival is not considered a part of it. Food, which is a basic need to just stay alive, is something that is not available to every person still. Total starvation is not the only thing that is concerning, though. One analysis suggests that when poverty is measured by the ability to afford a healthy diet and basic necessities, over 2.5 billion people worldwide still fall short of that threshold. That's roughly one third of the global population. Even with improvements in food availability, a large number of countries are not on track to eliminate hunger by 2030, and persistent malnutrition remains concentrated in poorer regions of South Asia and Africa. Undernutrition contributes to nearly half of all deaths among children under 5 globally. For the sake of measurement, starvation is defined narrowly as prolonged caloric deprivation severe enough to cause visible physical collapse or death. Anything short of that is often excluded, which means that even these numbers only capture the most extreme forms of deprivation. Hence, even with such bizarre numbers, we're barely scratching the iceberg of the issues regarding this topic. Availability and affordability aside, the accessibility to good quality food is also something to ponder about in terms of this. For example, personally, I do not have to face starvation as we are able to afford enough to eat. But what I can relate to on an everyday basis is the quality of food that we receive as compared to someone who can afford better. Ingredients are grown with harmful chemicals to be sold at a low price, while organically grown, healthier options are rare and therefore more expensive. This inadvertently results in more health concerns for the already suffering classes and only amplified by the lack of clean and healthy surroundings, good work life balance, and other consequences that come with simply being in the lower tiers of the pyramid. And as health concerns accumulate, access to care diminishes, the need increases, the availability recedes. Researchers tracking healthcare access in multiple countries, including high income ones, found that people in poorer households face worse access in roughly 70 to 80% of health access measures compared with those in high income groups. Poorer people are less likely to have a regular source of care, health insurance, or timely treatment. The World Health Organization and World Bank consider healthcare spending catastrophic when it exceeds 40% of a household's income after essentials. Many low and lower middle income countries' out of pocket costs represent far more than that. Moreover, when emergency cases or rarer conditions are considered, the treatment is not readily available to all, and because of its rarity, it usually is concentrated in more affluent health institutions. Sure, we are having new discoveries and inventing top tier medical technology at a rapid pace with the fast development of scientific fields. And oh, yes, it is a boon, but it certainly is not a boon for all. Advancement is restricted to those who can afford it, and innovations which were built with utmost love to help only serve to worsen class distinctions in such societies. Thus, the rich already claim the future, but the poor cannot even save their souls. The sanity of a person is not a priority in a system that profits from the exploitation of labor, and the poor are that labor. Health in this context is reduced to treatment rather than prevention. Illness is addressed only once it becomes unavoidable, while the conditions that produce it, sleep deprivation, chronic stress, and the absence of rest, are normalized as discipline. Long hours, unstable schedules, and the glorification of exhaustion are not cultural accidents, they are structural necessities to keep this labor focused system intact. A person's value is reduced to productivity as if human existence holds no worth unless it contributes economically to the very system that trains it. In such a scenario, which is a lived reality for many, leisure is an asset, and things that should be naturally accessible to all equally are suddenly not so. One of such things that I speak of is sleep. Sleep, often spoken as a personal habit, functions as a class privilege. For those living paycheck to paycheck, rest is interrupted by multiple jobs, long commutes, unsafe environments, and the constant negotiation between time and survival. Exhaustion is not a temporary state, it is the baseline. A good 8 hours of sleep becomes a rarity, almost a reward, despite how detached rest should be from money altogether. Research consistently shows that low income individuals are significantly more likely to experience insufficient sleep, often getting fewer than 7 hours a night. Global surveys further link lower income to poorer sleep quality overall, more awakenings, lower satisfaction, and chronic exhaustion. Medical reviews show that regularly sleeping less than 6 hours per night is associated with serious health risks, including metabolic disruption, higher risk of diabetes, cardiovascular problems, weakened immune function, cognitive decline, and mood disorders, as well as increased mortality risk. Stress follows the same logic. It is not an occasional pressure, but a permanent condition, embedded into daily life through financial precarity and the absence of safety nets. Under such conditions, mental health deteriorates quietly long before it becomes visible enough to warrant attention. These conditions are not rare, they're widespread. A global survey found that around 65% of workers said stress negatively affected their work, and many also reported concerns about their mental health. Other reports show that 80% of workers experience stress on the job, with higher rates among women compared with men. Medical sources highlight that chronic stress contributes to serious health problems including high blood pressure, heart disease, stroke, diabetes, obesity, and can exacerbate existing physical conditions, which is an aspect to which the poor are already more vulnerable to because of not only the reasons we discussed above, but also because their social class also lands them in places that are not the most suitable for survival, anyways. Communities consisting of lower income individuals are usually the ones which face problems like water shortage or poor quality of water. Terrible waste management and waste accumulation around the place, shortage of greenery in the surroundings in urban cases, poor quality of unconcerned authorities for such problems because calling out authorities and keeping them in check requires time, energy, and persistence, resources already consumed by the act of survival itself. Globally, research has found that working 55 plus hours per week is associated with significant health risks. People working these longer hours have a 33% higher risk of stroke and a 13% greater chance of developing coronary heart disease compared to those working standard hours. Studies in public health show that low wages combined with long unstable hours create ongoing physical and psychological stress, which contributes to chronic health conditions such as diabetes or heart disease. Work life balance then exists more as rhetoric than reality. The language of hustle reframes overwork as virtue and survival as ambition. What is presented as choice is for many compulsion, and in the process, social life erodes, not through lack of desire, but through lack of time and energy. Isolation becomes yet another unaccounted cost of being poor. Humans are social creatures drawn instinctively towards safety, acceptance, and belonging. Yet, in a reality shaped by economic precarity, social life itself becomes a luxury. Connection requires time, energy, and often money, resources that survival steadily consumes. Many social rituals assume disposable income, meeting friends at a cafe, buying gifts, traveling for celebrations, even the unspoken cost of simply showing up. Familial bonds strain when productivity leaves little room for presence. Friendships erode not from lack of care, but from repeated absence, missed plans, unreturned messages, explanations too embarrassing to voice aloud. Over time, withdrawal becomes easier than exposure. Romantic relationships are not exempt from this logic. Although love is often framed as unconditional, the expectations surrounding it are deeply class coded. Gestures of affection are increasingly measured through material display, turning care into performance and financial capacity into proof of devotion. In such a framework, lack of wealth quietly disqualifies people from being seen as worthy partners, even when emotional commitment exists. The social erosion carries consequences far beyond loneliness. Large scale public health studies have shown that chronic social isolation is associated with a significantly higher risk of premature mortality, comparable to major physical health risk factors. Isolation is not merely painful, it is physiologically damaging. What emerges is a world where relationships are shallow, not by choice, but by design. Connection becomes transactional, and the entry fee is often service, emotional, financial, or otherwise, from those who already have the least to give. When these expectations go unmet, the failure is framed as personal, a bad friend, a bad partner, a quote unquote bad villager. Structural deprivation is recast as moral deficiency, and isolation is justified as discernment rather than recognized as loss. What makes this reality even more insidious is that its victims are rarely recognized as such. Deprived of solidarity and denied the language to name their suffering, they begin to internalize the world's justifications, slowly aligning themselves with the very logic that confines them. Survival becomes moralized, endurance is glorified, and the socio-economic divide reveals itself not as a ladder, but as a trap. There is a culture that worships hustle as salvation, one that promises escape from the quote unquote rat race through relentless self exploitation. Those who subscribe to it are taught to believe that proximity to the top 1% is not only attainable but obligatory. The flaw is not that they recognize the system as broken, but they, instead of resisting it, they allow themselves to be entirely absorbed by its logic. The socio-economic divide sustains itself not only through deprivation but through aspiration. What is commonly referred to as the rat race is framed as a path toward freedom, a necessary grind on the way to happiness. In reality, it functions as a glorified cage, one that convinces those inside it that endurance is choice and exhaustion is progress. The promise is simple and seductive: work now, live later. Sacrifice your youth, your health, and your time in exchange for the possibility of security and fulfillment at some undefined point in the future. The image of the top 1% is held up as proof that this path leads somewhere worth reaching, even though it remains statistically unattainable for most. Hope in this framework is not a refuge, it is a mechanism of control. You are told repeatedly that if you work just a little harder and wait just a little longer, success will eventually arrive. But the very function of a classes system is to preserve distinction, to ensure the continued existence of both the haves and the have nots. A world in which everyone succeeds equally is incompatible with a system that depends on hierarchy. If everyone is rich, then wealth itself loses its meaning. The consequences of this illusion are not abstract. For many, the pursuit of this promised escape takes the form of reckless financial decisions, debt traps, and destructive habits, gambling, speculative investments, and constant risk taking framed as ambition. When stability is made conditional on extraordinary sacrifice, desperation begins to masquerade as determination. For many, the promise of escape from the system materializes not as opportunity but as debt. Credit is framed as access and investment, yet for those without financial cushioning, it becomes a permanent condition rather than a temporary tool. Interest ensures that survival itself generates profit for someone else. Debt does not function as a ladder out of precarity, it functions as a leash that tightens the longer one struggles. Loans are marketed as a tool that can be used by smaller business owners to grow, but the market, already being ruled by huge corporations, requires a significant amount of investment, which is terribly risky for those who have to use debt as a leverage rather than put money out of their own pockets, simply because they cannot afford it as such. Many times, this transforms into a vicious cycle where you take a loan full of hope and find yourself in a situation where you are not able to repay it, and hence you take another loan for the sake of repayment of that loan, and the cycle just continues, driving you deeper and deeper into the mess. Loans aren't always taken for the sake of building a business, but other high level investments, which is the equivalent of buying a house for yourself in recent times, adding to the already present burden of simply surviving. The same logic extends into investment culture, where high risk financial decisions are marketed as ambition. Volatility is reframed as courage, and loss as personal failure rather than structural inevitability. Markets that reward those with capital and insider access are presented as equal playing fields, even though losses are borne individually while gains are absorbed institutionally. Risk is romanticized for those who cannot afford it, while those already in power are insulated from its consequences. Financial literacy would urge you to make low risk investments, but when the return on investment is so small and the effort required to eventually profit off of such a method is quite a lot, then not many are eager to take that path. Gambling represents the most distilled form of this illusion. It offers hope without ownership, agency without security, and escape without permanence. Thriving most in communities already marked by economic instability, it transforms desperation into revenue. The promise is never stability, only the chance of a miracle. And miracles, by definition, cannot be relied upon. In this way, when the system doesn't profit from labor, then it profits from belief itself. from the hope that one more sacrifice, one more risk, one more wager might finally be enough to break free. This hope is instilled through false mobility, where exceptions are shown as proof, structural barriers are reframed as mindset problems, and inequality is treated as temporary misfortune, not design. The system needs people to believe two things at the same time. Upward mobility is possible, so they keep trying. Downward mobility is catastrophic, so they keep complying. This is what makes mobility false. Rising is statistically rare, and falling is immediate, visible, and brutal. The promise of rising sustains the system initially. The fear of falling sustains it permanently. Once people realize, consciously or not, that rising is unlikely, stability is fragile, and one illness, one missed payment, one mistake can undo everything, then the motivation shifts. They don't keep participating because they believe in reward, they keep participating because exit is punished. Leaving the system risks homelessness, hunger, social death. Non participation is framed as laziness or deviance. Falling is not just economic, it's moralized. So compliance becomes survival. Under such conditions, vulnerability is not a moral failing, it is an inevitability. And legitimate avenues for stability are systematically restricted. People are pushed towards informal or criminalized means of survival. This is not because of inherent deviance, but because the system narrows the definition of acceptable participation while expanding the consequences of exclusion. The irony is that the same structure that manufactures desperation then punishes it. Those who fall out of alignment are no longer framed as victims of inequality, but as threats to order. Poverty becomes a criminalized, and criminalization becomes a justification. On top of that, the ones who suffer from this have little to no sort of support system to turn to be extracted out from this dilemma. They are left to fend for themselves, and when they do, they suffer more because of it. Moral rigidity is used as harsh judgment for individuals that are struggling to survive in environments which have no space for thinking about ethical alignments and legal obligations. It doesn't mean such acts suddenly become right, but with no other way in sight, it is not hard to understand why someone would turn to such methods. They also become more vulnerable to being victims of criminal behavior themselves, and again, not enough support from authorities that are supposed to protect them. In this way, false mobility does not merely sustain the socioeconomic divide, it enforces it, and the socioeconomic state of an individual further influences every other aspect that counts, condemning the ones at an already disadvantageous position to hardships that they shouldn't have to face. The socioeconomic divide, thus, the socioeconomic divide fails us. Our own system fails us, but it still thrives because the winners want it to be so. The tragedy is not that the system fails so many people. The tragedy is that it functions exactly as intended. It extracts labor, time, health, and hope, then reframes the damage as individual weakness. It offers just enough possibility to keep people striving and just enough punishment to keep them afraid. Those who endure are praised for their resilience, those who collapse are blamed for their fragility, and in between, entire lives are spent mistaking survival for success. To name this reality is not cynicism, it is clarity. And clarity is the first thing a system like this tries to take away. We are taught to admire those who survive the system and to distrust those who cannot. But survival under exploitation is not virtue, and collapse under pressure is not failure. They are both predictable outcomes of the same design. A society that demands exhaustion as proof of worth and precarity as discipline is not broken, it is obedient to its own logic. The question is not why so many people are struggling, isolated, and unwell. The question is why we have been trained to accept this as normal. Humans were never meant to live like this, measured in output, valued in profit, permitted rest only when it can be justified. We are social, fragile, and finite. Yet we are asked to function as machines in a system that consumes what it cannot repair. What is called discipline is often deprivation, what is called ambition is often fear, and what is called success is frequently nothing more than the ability to endure what should never have been required in the first place. A system that demands so much from people while offering so little in return does not need more loyalty, it needs to be named for what it is. If being poor is treated as a sin, then what we are witnessing is not moral decay among the many, but sanctioned violence by the few. Thus, in modern society, being poor is not just a condition, it is a crime without a trial, a sin without redemption.